swept away again. I'm late to you. We'll shine again. Late to you. Suddenly lost so late. I'm late to you. We'll shine again. Late to you.
We break away. Yeah, you're just another rainy day. So don't buckle from the way. Yeah, we're just slowing down. Yeah, we're just slowing down. Just slowing down. Just slowing down. Just slowing down. Yeah, the space, it seems the same. Made out of rooms cold and grey. Filled with words you'd never say. Yeah, slowing down. We're just slowing down. Just slowing down. We're just slowing down. We're just slowing down.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the main hall for the first of our concurrent sessions of the conference. My name is Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, so one of your co-hosts for the conference together with the Queensland Government. I'd like to welcome you all to this session about housing first, and before we jump into that, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and to pay my respects to the elders of this place, both past and present and emerging, and also to acknowledge and pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room with us today. I will introduce our speakers and panellists in just a moment, but before I do, we're here to talk about housing first, and I thought it would probably be worth just quickly saying what that is to make sure that we're on the same page here. Housing first is I guess a novel concept that people who don't have a house and who are homeless maybe need housing first before they can get on with dealing with other issues that are going on in their lives, and that the connection of housing and I guess other support that people who experience homelessness have is vital for the long-term tenancy of people in that predicament and for their long-term well-being. And today we have a group of people who have been, I guess, focused on implementing housing first policy at state level and also in the territory, and who are going to bring, I guess, a range of experiences in terms of implementing and running programs. Before I introduce them, a little bit of housekeeping as well, just to, I guess, say hello also to the people who are joining us online. This is one of the sessions that is taking place obviously in the room here, but also as part of our hybrid conference in the online environment. And so we'll be taking questions for the panel after this, after people have spoken. And if you're in the room, you just need to put up your hand, and we have people with roving mics who can come around and take your questions. But people online, you will obviously need to put your questions through the online portal. There's a tab on the right-hand side where you can add those, and we have someone in the room who's going to be assisting me in terms of moderating and collating those and sending them through to an iPad that I've got. And all going well, we'll be able to field a number of questions, and apologies in advance. I'm sure we won't be able to field all questions, as is often the case, but we'll do our best to make sure we address issues and questions that people want to raise. All right, our first speaker will be Humair Ahmad. He's from the Department of Communities and Justice in New South Wales and is a specialist in social and affordable housing. Humair is an architect and an urban planner by background and training, and is currently the Director of Community Housing at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. After Humair, we will hear from two speakers hailing from the ACT, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to break up their time, but I'll leave that to them. But to just introduce them both, Geoff Agnier is currently the Acting Executive Group Manager for the Housing Assistance Division in the ACT Government's Community Services Directorate, and he has over 23 years' experience as a senior executive in government and in the corporate and community services sector. And joining him will be Anne Kirwan, who is the CEO of the Marymead CatholicCare Canberra and Goulburn region, who has worked in community and social services for over 30 years. Anne is committed to working with both government and community partners to build a stronger sector and to improve the diversity of service options by investing in new initiatives which disrupt our fractured system and improve service integration and support self-determination for clients. And then finally, we will hear from Sherri Bruinhout. Sherri is the Executive Director of Homelessness and Housing Support at the Victorian Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. She has worked for over 20 years in government and also in non-government settings, and has made a contribution there to homelessness, to affordable housing and to community inclusion. I think addressing homelessness, I should have said rather. I hope she hasn't contributed to homelessness. Solving it, I suggest, would be a more appropriate way of putting that. All right, well, Humair, you're up first, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say about what's been happening in New South Wales.
Thanks, Tom, for the induction. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting and pay my respects to all the elders past, present and emerging, and those that might be with us today. So why Together Home? So this opening slide is really just setting the context of the context in which the program came about. And of course, it was a COVID response. We had many people in motels and hotels all over the city, mainly rough sleepers, who were sort of evacuated and moved into those residential facilities because of the risk of the spread. And we were asked to stand up a program very quickly, and that happened within 3 or 4 weeks that we came up with the program, and we sort of actually stood it up. And the reason, I think, the reason for the success of the program is the nature in which it came about. Because we had a long history of successful Housing First programs running in the state, and Rebecca sitting in the audience there, Platform 70 comes to mind, Rebecca, and other initiatives like Housing Connect and Step. We had a long history of running time-limited kind of limited subsidy programs that involved the private rental market. So we had contracts in place, and we had the infrastructure in place to stand up the program very quickly. And because we didn't have a very firm idea of what the program might look like, that helped in the evolution of the program as well, because the design evolved with our community housing providers, partners, and also the specialist homelessness services. Yep, I think I've covered everything in that slide. So the model, so I think in my presentation, I'll focus on the model itself and how sort of it evolved and how it was improved. As I said before, we have been doing Housing First for a very long time, and we wanted to sort of maintain that fidelity with the model itself as much as we could, considering the circumstances. One of the things we had to do, because we had to stand up the program very quickly, we didn't have time to sort of separately fund support. So we trialed a new way of doing that, and it wasn't done before in New South Wales at least, where we entrusted the community housing providers with both the support funding and also the leasing subsidies. So the community housing providers were funded for both support and the leasing subsidies. Now, of course, that was delivered separately because the community housing providers subcontracted SHS services and other support providers, not just the specialist homelessness services, to provide support. And the writing instructions really were that whatever a client needs, so if a client needs mental health support, get that support. So the community housing provider actually became that kind of key point of integration of the support and wrapping the support around the client rather than block funding that we usually do against multiple programs. So that the fact that we had to stand up the program so quickly created that innovation almost. So all up, we have funded 1117 combined head leasing and support packages, including 107 high needs packages delivered mainly through the peak and 35 Aboriginal-led packages. And I think I'll touch upon how we came up with the idea of using the homelessness peak to deliver the high needs packages. Again, something that was never done before. Traditionally, a housing peak doesn't do funding disbursements. But again, it was the pressure of rolling it out quickly. It was the pressure of actually sending the money out of the door very quickly. And, again, that was a fabulous collaboration and a decision that we are very happy with because it was an independent allocation, like the whole decision-making process for allocating very generous high needs packages. I think we're looking at around $78,000 per client outside of government. And then the Peak Homelessness New South Wales, they set up a whole advisory body and a committee that had multiple reps including some people from the NDIA, who sort of helped identify those clients that needed more extra support on top and provided the funding to them. And they're still managing the program very successfully. We also trialed an Aboriginal-led model with a support provider called Kirwan in the Central Coast, and 35 Aboriginal-led packages were also part of the program. As I said before, the program was delivered through community housing providers. We had 18 community housing providers all up delivering the program across the state. So it was a statewide program, both in regional and metro areas. And again, I think the fact that it was so flexible and fluid, there was no firm ideas going into the program. So we were quite open to listening, and we listened and the model evolved. We were very flexible. We said to the provider, just provide the service to the client, whatever service that the client needs, without actually saying or predetermining what it should be. We also provided a lot of flexibility in funding. So we said, okay, you've received both leasing subsidy, housing, and support funding. It's up to you how you use it. So you could, for some clients, maybe they needed more support, and they could actually move into a capital property right away. So then you're saving on the leasing dollars. But we said that use the leasing and the support dollars interchangeably and flexibly as the client needs. We also had 3 tranches. The program was sort of delivered in 3 tranches. It's going to be a 4-year program now. And we said, okay, don't worry about which tranche of clients that you are receiving funding in. Use the funding across tranches flexibly as well. So I think if I look at the model for Together Home program, I think the biggest thing is its flexibility, and it continues to be flexible. So the whole program guidelines have evolved over time, and we continue to change them as the program evolves. So it's a 2-year service model. So we are providing initially funding for 2 years in the hope that the client would be able to be housed in more permanent, long-term social housing beyond the 2 years. We, of course, and in subsequent slides, I'll kind of explain how we've had to provide some extra funding as well just to keep those clients in the program, because for a lot of our really high needs clients, 2 years funding is not enough. Okay, so moving on. So the cost of the program. So we have invested as a government 189 million across 3 tranches. That includes 79 million for leasing and support funding packages, 8 million for high needs packages, 72 million of capital funding for new supply, and 30 million to extend clients beyond the 2-year service model where needed. So I just want to touch upon the 72 million of capital funding for new supply. So this was based on an innovative model that we have developed in New South Wales called the Community Housing Innovation Fund, where we provide an upfront grant funding to a community housing provider, and then the provider also co-contributes to the cost of the dwelling. So we are delivering almost 280 dwellings for just an investment of 72 million by the state government, because the rest of the cost is being borne by the community housing providers. And that's the beauty of upfront funding, because it reduces all costs. If you have upfront funding, you have less borrowing costs, you have other costs that you can minimize. And it really makes a lot of those projects that will not see the light of the day possible, because you have upfront cash in your hands. And again, I think we factored in that we might deliver 220 dwellings for that kind of money based on a previous program, the Innovation Fund. But the community housing providers, they have exceeded the target, and we are delivering 280 dwellings under this. So that was, again, an innovation in a sense that because we knew that the private rental market was very tight, and there will be issues in either accessing the market or long-term exit options for those clients. We needed capital supply to come in there as well. So in the middle of the slide, I just wanted to sort of focus on Angus, and because I think just to sort of refocus ourselves on the client itself, and what he says here, which says Together Home has changed my life. I now have a home and my family's back in my life. I think that's a very recurring theme when we do client case studies, is that for a lot of those people, their life has been changed by the stability of housing and the support that's available, and they have reconnected with families. Some have, obviously health and other outcomes have improved, and I'm sure Tom will capture that in the evaluation as well. So I just wanted to sort of quickly look at Angus's story. And again, I think what he's trying to say is that, it's set him up for generations to come. So, I mean, it's a turnaround in his life. So what are the successes, really? So to date, we have housed, 1,374 rough sleepers have received support, with 1,152 clients who've been housed. 195 complex needs clients have been housed and are supported. As I said before, the central role for the peak body in delivering high needs packages and adequate funding. 277 new dwellings built or planned. Again, a continuous improvement approach. As I said before, we are keeping on refining the program. And again, a genuine, so I think you can't say that for many programs that governments run, but this one is a true partnership, where we have delivered this because of our really strong, stable, enduring relationships with the community housing sector and the SHS sector. So for any jurisdiction, I think having those partners, they're ready to sort of implement a program at very short notice, themselves gearing up to deliver, I think is a major achievement, I think, in that sense. And I mean, we have had exits, clients exits, 656. Some of them have been positive. I think around 50% have been positive exits, and there have been some negative exits. I mean, with this client group, we have had some people going to get incarcerated. There's some who've died, and some who've disengaged with support, and that's the client group we were dealing with. And I think the fact that we have retained so many clients in the system is again testimony to the fact that we have got the settings right, and we feel very confident about that. Key challenges and learnings. So again, I think everybody's aware of this, that there are limited exit options. There is just not enough supply. So when we first started off with a 2-year funding model, the hope was that that's enough time to then find a longer term solution, because that was a leasing subsidy mainly in the market. And that remains to be an issue. There are not that many exit options. Even the social housing system doesn't have that much of a churn. It is, I mean, it's still happening, and because we provided extension funding, so for all tranches 1, 2, and 3, we provided extra funding for those clients who might need a longer term support. So that remains a challenge. As I said before, good governance is key. So we set up a lot of governance mechanisms, both at a kind of higher level, which was more strategic direction setting. Then we had a lot of implementation groups and best practice kind of sharing. And that was something that really was useful in sort of steering the program through. As I said before, client disengagement is a big risk with this client group, and they can, I mean, the tenancy can be at risk if the supports, if they disengage with support. So we have had instances where clients have disengaged with support and the tenancy has been put in jeopardy. And then choice is not always possible. I mean, we've tried to sort of remain as sort of true to the housing first model, but especially around housing, the choices are not there for those clients. So it has been very difficult to source housing for a lot of those clients because the clients had very specific needs, and under the housing first model, you have to sort of take client on the journey and provide the housing they need. And in the kind of rental market we were operating, that wasn't always possible. But I think that's a kind of a good snapshot of what the challenges and learnings are. So early evaluation, the evaluation is being conducted by AHURI. The findings are quite positive. Early findings we have already published on our website, so people can have a look at them. What the evaluation found that was this program was bridging a very important gap in the homelessness system. And that's leading to strong housing outcomes, though exit options remain an issue. I think that's not a surprise to anyone. High needs packages, I think, are particularly quite important because of some of the clients with really complex needs. We needed that extra funding to really stabilize them in the housing itself and provide the very, very deep sort of housing support needs that they had across multiple areas. And of course, the evaluation also notices regional differences. I think markets are different and the support systems are different in different areas, and that comes out quite strongly there. The new supply component, the 280 dwellings, again, is being sort of considered quite good in the evaluation. I think that's a good summary. And I think one of the things I mentioned before, the continuous improvement kind of nature of the program, that we've kept changing the program and changing the settings to sort of respond to the needs, emerging needs, as we came about them. So I will like to end my presentation on this slide. There are again 2 case studies, and I probably just want to focus on Luke this time. And his issue wasn't like a typical issue. His main issue was that was dental issue. Like that was affecting his speech. He would slur his words. He wasn't confident. And traditionally, a housing first program doesn't provide medical kind of, dental support. But this time, because that was his need, that's what was focused on. And I think in one of the things he said was that he was able to smile after a very, very long time. And that was a very heartwarming thing for us and the team, that small intervention of just getting his teeth fixed completely transformed his life. And I think in many different ways, this program is trying to do that. So I think that's the end of my presentation, Tom. Thanks. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Humair, for that overview and, I guess, discussion of some of the early observations on outcomes from the Together Home program, which is the New South Wales government's statewide Housing First informed initiative. And we'll be hearing shortly about a very similar program in Victoria. But before we do that, I'd like to invite the ACT guests that we have here today to come and talk about a program that they've been delivering. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll just speak and then we'll go to the slides. And after that, okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to provide a bit of context and then try and quickly get to the core of the presentation on the Axial program. I really want to showcase the great work that Marymead Catholic Care has done in partnership with Housing ACT. So it's an important reminder for those of us who work in Canberra that we are quite a unique territory, so I might just give you a bit of an overview of what we're about. So we have 450,000 residents in the territory. There are 22,000 public housing residents in just over 12,000 public housing tenancies. So that's, compared to some of the other jurisdictions like Victoria and New South Wales, it's quite small. From memory, the Sydney local government area has more public housing residents than all of the territory. So we are a bit of a microcosm. But the proportion of households residing in public housing is about 6.4% of all households, so that's about double the national average. I live in Sydney and work in Canberra, and I was kind of surprised when I started this job. I was expecting a much more homogenous population. There's a lot of diversity and complexity, pockets of vulnerability. So there is, it's not an easy challenge working with homelessness. One of the advantages, though, of a small jurisdiction is that you can roll out system-level stuff across and experiment across quite a wide area, which is much harder to do in bigger systems. And also, and I think this is core to the Housing First work, there's an intimacy with the issue and the people involved. I often hear ministers talk about people living rough by first name, so I think that's an important part of this work. In 2018, we released what we called the cohort study, which looked at people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And some of the interesting things we found were that the demand for permanent and long-term accommodation for people with high and complex service needs was often unmet. People with high and complex service needs were more likely to be provided with short-term rather than longer-term accommodation. And those who got support around their accommodation often had their needs met and were able to sustain housing for longer. It sounds really obvious when I say all that, doesn't it? So what we found is that we were failing about 10% of our housing and homelessness service clients who had high and complex service needs. They either couldn't navigate the sector, excluded because of their complexity, or had challenges in a shared setting. So in this context, off the back of the cohort study, Mary Mead Catholic Care approached us to partner with them on the Axial program. This was the first Housing First pilot for the ACT to fill a gap in support for rough sleepers. So we targeted rough sleepers who'd been sleeping rough for 2 up to 30 years, who we knew would not be able to sustain a tenancy without supports. There were really strict criteria around that. We excluded people on our public housing waiting list or on community housing waiting lists because being on that list by implication meant that you should be able to sustain a tenancy. And that's the kind of entry for you, and let us tell you what we did. Anne.
Thanks, Geoff. Now there's a clicker here. So, beautiful. Thank you. Hi everybody, I'm Anne Kirwan. I'm the CEO of the newly merged Mary Mead Catholic Care, and I'm presenting here with Geoff today. I'll just start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of First Nations people, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course give a shout out to anybody who was born, raised or works on the land of the Ngunnawal, Narrabri, Wiradjuri, Yuin or Gundungurra people. Hello all of us. It's a great place to live and raise a family. So Geoff's just talked about a few things. I think what's important is to know that what we're talking about is a subgroup of the homelessness population. So this pilot was targeting rough sleepers. It was targeting people who'd been on the streets between 2 and 30 years. And you have to think this was in Canberra. So you have to understand the complexity of being someone who sleeps rough on the streets of Canberra in their car for, say, 25 years. There's a lot going on with that person. You don't want to be sleeping rough in Canberra if you can avoid it. And in terms of the strict criteria, if someone was receiving support or on a waiting list, they had demonstrated that they have the skills to navigate the system, therefore they were not participating in this pilot. So we really went for people who had given up on getting through the system in any way, and so as a result were never going to achieve a housing outcome because they weren't in the system. In terms of screening for the VI SPDAT, It was different at times to how you accept referrals. The higher your level of complexity and need, the more eligible you were. So in fact, we were talking to providers. We would have people who had been sleeping in their cars with their children for 3 months. Situation is terrible, but they were not eligible for this pilot. It was particularly targeting people who had incredible complexity and had fallen through the gaps. We also targeted people, homeless people with dogs, because we know that all our services exclude clients with dogs, and also transgender clients, because we know that the system is not set up to work with transgender people in the ACT in general, in terms of housing for women or housing for homeless men. So what did we actually do? So it was a partnership between Housing ACT, Merrymead Catholic Care and the ACT government. So Merrymead Catholic Care, we restructured one of our existing programs to release 1 FTE worth of funding to fund a role to work within the Housing First. In terms of the ACT government, what happened over time was they then released funding for 1 FTE because the program grew during COVID. Initially we were supported to house 20 people, but as soon as COVID came and we wanted to get as many people off the street as possible, we reached out and supported 36 people. And at the time there was an average of 70 to 100 people sleeping rough in the ACT that the Rough Sleepers Working Group had worked on to try and identify. There's a lot of cross-referencing of names and people to be able to get to a realistic number. There's a lot of double counting that can happen at times in terms of people sleeping rough or accessing our homeless services. The caseloads were quite high. They were 1 FTE to 14 to 18, which is higher than typical models for rough sleeping programs, or Housing First. And of course, Housing ACT provided or released the properties to us and we head leased them. As a key part of this is having a trusting relationship with the ACT government, and the ACT government having a trusting relationship with a service provider. Of course, what happened in accepting those head leases was we took on all risks relating to rent, property damage, rental arrears, squatters, hoarders, drug dealers moving in, you name it, it all happened. They were risks that we were comfortable with because we were a proven provider and we worked in this space all the time. But we did have conversations with Housing ACT when we initially rolled out the pilot, and they said, we're going to release these properties to you with no funding and you're going to manage them for long-term rough sleepers, was around, well, hang on a second here. And the discussion we had was, look, we're prepared to take on this risk, but if the costs get out of control, we're going to come back to you to have a conversation. And of course, through fantastic management by our housing arm within Merrymead Catholic Care, we never needed to go back to the government, but it was always nice to have that backup to say, you know, it is unrealistic to think that we will cover all those costs if they get out of control. One of the great outcomes for Axial Housing is that we get referrals through any door, and we are getting self-referrals from people on the streets, and they're referring their friends. So what did happen in the rollout was that, you know, someone had been sleeping rough for 5 years with their mate John, who slept near them. We ended up providing accommodation to this gentleman. It's a 2-bedroom flat. Of course, what happens was he moves in his friend who he slept next to for the last 5 years during Canberra winter, during COVID. It's a warm place. Of course, that's going to happen. So what we did was then we worked with the person who'd moved in to say, can we work with you and get you your own place rather than placing your friend's accommodation at risk. So that's one of the greatest challenges we have is about building relationships of trust and rapport. We would receive a referral from someone in community. You know, someone's down in Sullivan's Creek with 2 dogs in a tent. You go down there, you talk to them, you come back the next day, they've gone. So there is a real challenge in engaging this cohort once they know that someone's going to come out and visit them. So it's really important that we have a good reputation and we receive self-referrals from the rough sleeping community. One of the excellent outcomes that we had was in terms of the cohort we're supporting was recognising the incredibly important role that mental health services provide in supporting people sleeping rough in community. We would say that almost 100% of participants had complex chronic mental health issues, and the majority of them receiving no support from the mental health services in the ACT because of the challenges engaging with them. So what we were able to receive through the ACT government was funding for a community community mental health worker who was part of the homeless sector, not part of the mental health sector. And that's a key component here. We were challenged by engaging the mental health ACT services. We would call them to go out and visit person X. They would go out and visit person X who's been sleeping in the cold in shorts and thongs covered in faeces, and they would say, oh yes, you know, it's not good, but they're not a risk to themselves or other people, so they're okay. What we needed to do was we needed to open doors to our clients to get them support and services so that we could then move with them to providing them with long-term housing. So this role actually worked with the rough sleeping community and with those services who worked with rough sleepers to open doors. So it wasn't an axial resource, it is a resource for the whole sector working with that cohort, and it's been a fantastic outcome for us. And the other key component is we set up 36 housing with absolutely no houses with no funding. So what we did was initially we bought 20 fridges, 20 microwaves, 20 washing machines, dryers, TVs, beds, everything for this cohort, and we received support from 2 charities in the ACT to do that, and there was incredible goodwill from the whole community to support us to do this, which of course we rolled out for 36 people. You know, initially you might think, would you really do that for someone and expect in a week for all that property to still be there? Well, absolutely. The majority of the cases our clients were so pleased to be provided with new equipment and stuff that was theirs that in a lot of occasions they ended up bursting into tears saying, I can't believe this is for me, as they moved into the flats, and they took incredible care of their property. So shout out to those charities that supported us. In terms of who we cared for, 90% of the participants were men, 5% were female, 5% were transgender, 15% of the population were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and 10% of our community had accompanying dogs. And those of you who've worked with rough sleeping or homeless people know that their dogs are their children and they will not accept housing if they cannot take their children with them. So we had to create opportunities for them to bring their dogs with them. 10% of the community were called, 100%, as I've mentioned, had complex mental health issues, and the majority of people that we worked with over time, we spoke to them, had early childhood trauma, and obviously we can look at the trajectory of people and you can see sadly where people can end up if there isn't early intervention in terms of supports for them. The average age of a participant was 52, the oldest sadly 69, and the youngest was 30. Now, in terms of what we did or what we did differently in this pilot, the higher the vulnerability and complexity, the more eligible people were for support. So we were accepting clients that had been blacklisted or excluded from other services. The clients determined where they wanted to live, what part of the ACT they wanted to live in, what type of housing, high, low density, ground floor, garden unit, older persons unit, what can we provide for them? Noting, of course, that selection is absolutely key to a housing outcome. That was a challenge for us because housing supply and stock is very limited, and we found that we were knocking back properties that we knew were untenable anyway and that would not lead to a successful outcome for our clients. And we had to really work with Housing ACT and their staff to understand the fundamentals of a housing first pilot, to know that actually the selection of the client tells you what you want and then you match it to a property. You don't release the property and then see if it's suitable for the client. We also worked with people who needed lots and lots of support. Sometimes 5 times a day we were interacting with this cohort of client group. We needed really skilled and experienced staff in this program who could tolerate antisocial behaviour, getting sworn at. We would get abusive phone calls from clients. We would leave it for 24, 48 hours, call them back, reconnect with them. If it happened again, we'd again leave it for 24, 48 hours. So you had to really have your best staff on this program. You couldn't have someone who said, oh, he swore at me, so we need to actually disconnect them from the program. That's not the reality of the people that you're working with, who have significant, at times, antisocial and terrible interpersonal behaviours. Obviously, drug and alcohol use, squatters, people moving in, their drug dealers to cover for their drug debts and then calling us to say, can you help me move them out? Significant challenges. We had some people remove every panel from the property because they thought we'd put microphones in the walls of the houses. So it all happened, and that's who we're talking about. So we have to be really careful too. If you want to work in a housing first space with people with high and complex needs, you need to be a provider who has a very high risk tolerance, and you know what you're getting yourself in for, because this is who we're supporting. These are the people that you care for, and you have to be prepared to get in and stay in with them and walk the journey with them. You can't just flick a switch and ask them to leave the minute they breach rules, because it's not going to be one rule, it's going to be 5 or 10 rules that you end up having to work with the clients to support them to sustain their tenancy. In response to one of the presentations I heard earlier today, it's really important to emphasise it's not just the housing. It's not the housing, it is the wraparound support that is crucial. And for the cohort that we were supporting, if you didn't have the wraparound supports, within 6 months the majority of our participants would have been back on the streets, homeless, but also then they would have had increased debts with housing ACT, property damage, and another housing breakdown to deal with. So that's really important in terms of the component. The program is externally evaluated by Ernst & Young. They looked at 2 things, the economics and the outcomes of the program. In terms of the outcomes, they found that, yes, we're absolutely working with the right people, and the clients often spoke about the program being life-saving for them, which was mentioned earlier. One of the unique things with our model is that we, as a large provider, have a property and maintenance arm, and we have the housing support arm. They're 2 separate departments, but within one organisation. So we were atypical in that we ran both within the one organisation. The report found this created successful outcomes, flexible, agile, client-centred. We think this is a real strength of our organisation, and there is a culture within the ACT government that there is this belief that you need to separate tenancy and support. We disagree with that position. We think the data shows that, in fact, if it's managed well, it can lead to successful housing outcomes and, in fact, increased retention rates. And our retention rates were over 80% for a very high and complex support group. It also leads to early intervention in terms of property management and maintenance, as well as, you can ring and say to somebody, you need to have someone there by 4 o'clock because, John's not well, or there's something going on with the lighting in his kitchen, and it can lead to actually a housing breakdown with some of our clients, that if there are maintenance issues in the properties, they will just walk away. So it's really important that you get that responsivity, and we have not found, working with external partners, that you can necessarily ring and say you need to have somewhere there by 4 o'clock and they actually show up and come. But if it's managed in-house, you can certainly pull the strings to make sure the supports are there. So we think it's a real strength, and we challenge the belief that actually you need to separate tenancy from support. In terms of being an organisation, it was reported that our risk tolerance in having worked in this space for long term is actually one of the strengths for us and important in terms of working with housing ACT. One of the challenges that we had was the release of housing stock to us, and obviously we were going through COVID and a whole lot of things, but having someone who's housing ready and ready to move, and then finding actually you had to wait 6 months for a suitable property was not a great outcome for some of our clients, and we did lose some of them in the wait process. A collaboration and a true partnership, as I mentioned, with Housing ACT and the ACT government was really important, to have that trusting relationship and to be able to pick up the phone and call someone and have a conversation with them was really important when things weren't going well. As well as the access to the broader range of services that Mary Mead Catholic Care had, as well as the relationships we have with a number of partners here in the room, but across the ACT, to be able to ring in and get our clients into their services was really important. And the recommendation was we needed to review the client to staff ratios because they were a little high. In terms of economic evaluation, they certainly found it was cost efficient. There was a return on investment. Of course, the pilot hadn't gone long enough really to be able to see economic returns, and they expect that to be, if there was a further review, that there would be greater returns for us. But the outcome was 5 people can be housed through this pilot for the cost of supporting 1 person in the health and justice system. It's really important, though, to consider when you're talking about outcomes to be mindful. You've got to understand who you're working with. So we certainly found that, in fact, interactions with health services increased once people were successfully housed, because we found a number of people we were caring for and working with ended up having significant health issues that had been untreated for years. We had a number of people who were diagnosed with cancer once they were successfully housed. So you can expect that in terms of the data, some of the data is a bit skewed depending on what's happening on and what you consider an outcome, a health outcome. In terms of key learnings for us, obviously, partnership with housing, you can't do it without housing, and it's really important to have a trusted partnership. Supply for us was a challenge, but the key is you have to have wraparound supports, not just a house, or your clients will come in and they will exit. The other thing is around sharing risk, so having a trusting relationship with government and being able to go to them and say, this isn't about delegating risk, we're all in this together. I think as a sector, we need to consider and review a lot of our models. A number of our models are old and tired and no longer responsive in terms of what's happening with the cohorts we're working with. So the ability to remodel our services, release resources to meet new and emerging needs is really important. And that's a challenge for us as a community sector. Sometimes we're doing things that we've done for years, but it may not be where the resources are best served. Complexity. There seems to be this conversation, or at least in the ACT, the clients are more complex, or strategic positioning from providers. We work with the most complex needs. No, we work with the most complex needs. No, we do. Actually, we're working with people, and I've worked in the sector. You wouldn't think it by looking at me, but I've been here for over 30 years. And 30 years ago, we were working with people who were exiting the prison system, people who were convicted sex offenders, people who used violence, mental health, drug and alcohol, relationship breakdown, gambling. All those issues were here 30 years ago. The change has been that 20 years ago, it took 13 weeks to house someone through Housing ACT when they were homeless, and now if you're a high priority client, it's almost a year. That is what changed. The people and their needs are still relatively the same. Happy for you to challenge me on that, but it's the position that I feel strongly about. The other thing is, if you're going to run a Housing First program, you need to make sure you don't put really green new staff on, or it'll be a disaster. As a sector, I put the challenge out to us. We say, I heard it earlier today, housing is a human right. Housing is a human right, and yet we exclude people from our services. Now, some of our services are not fit for purpose, I recognise that, but sometimes we're the problem. I think the last thing is to say that in this pilot, we were not successful with everybody. There is a cohort, a sub-cohort of rough sleepers who Housing First models will not work for. They are not housing ready, and I would challenge that there's going to be a long time before a cohort of these clients are going to be housing ready. So we still as a sector need to say Housing First, absolutely, this is the way to go, but we need other models for people who are not going to survive in that environment. We need to continue to help them instead of blacklisting them from every service, including the Housing First models. And lastly, because we're all about our clients and the client voice, we've got a testimonial from Dave. Police officer came, lady left a business card. I didn't contact them, came back and left another business card. I did give them a call, and that person was successfully housed. And now I've got a video that the Housing ACT did about Dave's story. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been living in my cars for over 20 years. Had a lot of help here and there off different charities, Vinnie's mainly. And then a gentleman in Gundaroo, Ron, told me about CatholicCare. And I gave CatholicCare a ring and was lucky enough to get Connor, who I've known for a little while. And you guys got me a great unit, and after being in my car for so long, I never thought it'd happen. But it's really too nice for us, but we're getting used to it. Doing gardening, vacuuming, everyday chores that living in your car you don't do. And having a cooker with 4 burners on it instead of 1. Cooking out of the rain, weather. Most of all being warm, having a heater. Trying to learn to cope with people, whenever I struggle with people. Just learning to eat properly, put on a bit of weight, and just trying to fit into society, really. Being homeless is pretty hard. There's a lot of judgmental people out there. But we're nice people, just got a few problems.
And how are you finding the neighbours?
Yeah, so far so good. They're all a bit older than me, and they're quiet. And just want to help, just want to care. I've been a taker all my life, so now it's time to give back. He likes the garden, the room compared to the old Tarago. But I think he's like me, we still struggle. We're used to having a small confined space, nothing like this. But it's great, trust me. Staying here, of course. And just want to help anybody I can. I'm not a counsellor or nothing, but I've been a drug addict, I've been abused, I've done a lot of different things. And we just got to help each other. But most of all, I'm a photographer, I'm trying to be. I take great photos, but because I'm homeless, you get judged. Oh, you're a homeless bum. Well, I might be a homeless bum, but I'm a great photographer, you know? That's how I see it. Yeah, being homeless, you know, I was a drug addict all my life. I gave up drugs 6 years ago. And there is more to, you got to hit lower than rock bottom. I've hit rock bottom. You got to lose everything and just go forward in life. You know, what I've got now, I never thought I'd have in a million years. You know, CatholicCare's donated me a lot of stuff. The people of Gundaroo have donated me a lot of stuff. And that's just, I look around and I think TV, lounge, I've never had that. Man, no, I won't cry because I don't cry, but it's just nice to have a place called home.
Hi everyone. In the interest of time, I'll just jump straight in and introduce myself. I'm Sherri Bruinhout. I'm an Executive Director of Homelessness and Housing Support at Homes Victoria, which is the state government body responsible in Victoria for the delivery of homelessness and housing services. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of traditional owners, always was and always will be, and to those owners I say yes. So, Housing First in Victoria. So Housing First in Victoria, we've rolled out one of the largest Housing First programs in Australia, but it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of warm-up space before the rollout of our Housing First programs at scale. So back in 2009, 2010, we had one of Australia's first common grounds in the wonderful city of Melbourne, and also one of Australia's first social impact bonds, which was Sacred Heart Mission's Journey to Social Inclusion, which is a Housing First program with a results-based payment program attached to it. Following on from that, we launched the Victorian Rough Sleeping Action Plan in 2018, and that plan really identified rough sleeping hotspots throughout metro and regional Victoria and funded the delivery of assertive outreach teams and supportive housing teams to respond to the needs of rough sleepers. And a small pilot of our transitional housing management program with rapid housing responses in there. But our challenge was that we had the beginnings of Housing First, but they were small in scale, they were locally based, but they hadn't been really taken to their full potential. So the challenge, I guess, for us in the department was to really be able to demonstrate the success of a Housing First approach in Victoria and really advocate for that approach to be taken to scale. So without this turning into a group therapy session from me, Victoria did it pretty hard during COVID. We were locked down a lot, and while lots of people were doing yoga and sourdough, our homelessness community and our homelessness services were in overdrive. So on that year, we had 105,000 people coming into specialist homelessness services. And over 12,000 of those people identified as rough sleeping. The other thing that we were finding, and this was a common trend in the years previous, was a bit over 60% were repeat clients. So, you know, if that was a horse, you just wouldn't back it, right? Like 60% of people coming in year on year into our homelessness service system looking for assistance. So COVID came in and we were in lockdown for a really long time, and government made a really significant commitment to provide hotel accommodation to all rough sleepers. We were thinking, based on the numbers, that might be somewhere around the 8,000 to 10,000 person mark throughout the state. Well, over the course of COVID, there was a bit under 34,000 households that received crisis accommodation in hotels during COVID. 34,000. that was over 1.4 million nights of hotel accommodation, and I tell you that really kept the hotel industry afloat during COVID, which was great, but more to the point, it kept people safe during a pandemic. But what that effectively did was set up very large crisis accommodation services that we weren't really thinking that we were going to be running. So at 24 of the largest hotels, we had 24/7 concierge services, we had on-site health services, and really used that as an opportunity to really dig in and provide support to people experiencing homelessness. And I know that there's a lot of agencies in the room today that worked very, very hard during that time, and really want to pay respects to those agencies, their boards, their staff, who really went into unknown territory and worked very hard during that period. No sourdough going on there. That was the catalyst though, because we had been able to provide that accommodation. As a government department, we had thousands of people in hotels and really needed to think about, well, what is the exit plan for those people? And what do you know, we'd had a decade of building the foundation of housing first approaches in Victoria, and were able to very quickly make some recommendations and advice to government about rolling out a housing first program at scale. So what we ended up with is the Homeless to Home program, which is predominantly for single adults who were experiencing homelessness, particularly rough sleeping, and the Homes for Families program, which is for singles or couples with accompanying children. That was $150 million over 2 years, and resulted in a $12 million recurrent ongoing funding commitment. So I want to tell you a little bit more about those programs. So who did we support? It was very precise numbers. So the Homeless to Home program supported 1,845 individuals. So there were 1,845 packages of support and housing. The reason why that number is very particular is because that's exactly the amount of people who were in hotel accommodation when our last lockdown finished. So essentially it was government's commitment to say every single person in hotels when lockdowns finish would be offered permanent supported housing program. Same with families, 170 families would be offered that outcome as well. That resulted in outcomes for over 800 children accompanying those families as well. So what did we provide? Through our very clever agencies, a pathway into permanent housing. So as of today, I think we've only got 3 households who are waiting for their permanent social housing offer, mainly because the needs that they have in their housing are so particular, we're probably going to have to build that house for them. But every single person in the Homeless to Home and Homes for Families program is offered long-term social housing. That's been offered through the $5.3 billion big housing build that's been rolling through Victoria, and that is the single biggest investment in social housing of any single state or territory. It also involved over 450 spot purchases as well. So the graph that we've got up is actually really interesting. So you look at, these are the numbers of people rough sleeping in Victoria. The yellow star represents the rough sleeping action plan. You remember I was talking about that, and that's where we put out assertive outreach teams and supportive housing. Now what you can see there is the numbers of people rough sleeping go up. That's a good thing because we're putting assertive outreach teams on the ground to engage with rough sleepers, so of course those numbers go up. But geez, you've really got to hold your nerve when, as a bureaucrat, you start seeing as a result of the programs that you've advocated for, numbers going up, up, up. It's a bit terrifying. But you can see the purple star is where the Housing First program, so the Homes for Families and Homeless to a Home program. And you can start to see that in Victoria, we're really proud that our trajectory is going down. So people experiencing rough sleeping in Victoria, we feel like we've really turned the corner on those numbers, and that's, I think, something that, that all those agencies can be very proud of. Lessons learnt. So this is the group therapy session. It was tough. You know, rolling out a really big program in the middle of a pandemic is not an ideal timing, but, you know, you make the best of a good crisis, right? So what we found, the way that would work the best is to really engage with the people that know best. So that's the agencies, the specialist homelessness services, community housing. It's local government. I think we've got City of Melbourne in the room. Absolutely fantastic. So being out, even though it's a very big program of over, you know, a couple of thousand people, what it actually looks like on the ground is 13 very distinct local programs across Victoria making very collective decision making in their local areas about how to best support the clients in the program. The pathways to stable housing was also a real challenge for us. So we didn't have 2,200 empty properties in public housing or social housing, community housing, to be able to bring into this program. No state or territory's got that many vacancies just sitting around waiting to be offered. And in fact, in Victoria, if you take away transfers, we only have about 2,500 to 3,500 new allocations in social housing each year. So when you think about trying to find long-term permanent social housing for over 2,200 households, when the yearly allocation is 2,500 to 3,500, you start to see where the rub of that plays. So it took us a couple of years to be able to find the right houses that meet people's needs. And we did that, and people stayed in head leased properties while we found their permanent housing options for them. But that created issues because not all head lease properties are really set up for people with high and complex needs to live happily alongside neighbours. So there were some real challenges in there. The other real challenges are when you take over 2,000 allocations into our service system, that has a knock-on impact to other priority cohorts who are also waiting for housing. That has a knock-on impact onto our waiting lists as well that we have to manage and be considerate of. And our other key learnings were in our practice models and supports. So, you know, you cut the cloth, you cut the pattern to the cloth you have. So originally the H2H program came out and there were 12 to 18 months packages of support. Our sector just collectively rolled their eyes at that, but that's what we had to offer. As the program has matured and developed, of course, those packages of support and the durations of support have been extended, and we're now looking at 3 years of support as what our learnings are telling us is most effective. Also, to Anne's previous comments, agencies did find it hard to deliver this program at scale. Workforce challenges are a real issue, and for us to be able to attract the best and the brightest into our service systems so that we can, you know, deliver these really high quality programs continues to be a challenge. But the other lesson that we learned is to date we've got over 80% of the Housing First programs clients are sustaining their housing. Some of them have come off their support packages, some are still continuing with support packages, but geez, 80%, it's hard to be cranky about that, right? So what are we doing next? We're rolling out social impact bonds. We now call them partnerships addressing disadvantage in Victoria, but you would know them as social impact bonds, so payment by result style. We've got social impact bonds looking at people experiencing homelessness, exiting corrections. We've got some social impact bonds for young people leaving care, and there's probably some more announcements to come on social impact bonds and Housing First. We're also looking at a self-determination process for our Aboriginal Victorians experiencing homelessness. We're pretty undercooked in Victoria, and I'm really keen to be listening in this conference about how we can really step up through a self-determined process to ensure that Aboriginal Victorians have the same, if not better, access to services that meet their needs, and we're rolling out some significant investments in Victoria at the moment. As I said earlier, back in 2009, we had one of Australia's first common grounds, one in the city of Melbourne. By the end of the next year or two, we're going to have 8 in Victoria. And to Anne's point previously, some people aren't great at popping them in a tenancy in the middle of the suburbs and just, giving them some support and hoping for the best. Common grounds are a really nice place for people who need that 24/7 wraparound support on site. So we found that through the Homeless to Home program particularly, there were some people who just weren't able to manage the types of tenancies that we were offering, and we've been able to invest in a further 7 common ground style facilities in Victoria to start to look at that gap particularly. There's a couple of regional ones, metro ones. There's a permanent supportive housing facility for people over the age of 50. There's one for families with kids. So we're really looking at a range of different permanent supportive housing models. And then lastly, we're about to roll out our Housing First program for young people leaving care, which is a really exciting way to think about housing first with a very particular cohort as well. So that's under planning and development with our leaving care sector. So all of that is a long way of saying that Victoria has a vision to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief and non-recurring, and we do that through a number of processes, through early intervention, targeted support, but also through the Housing First approaches that we've been talking to you about today. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for those presentations. We've really appreciated hearing about programs in 2 states and 1 territory around the country. And I'm aware, of course, that there are other programs in other states and territories that we haven't heard about today. Look, we're going to have a bit of a conversation together now, and we're also going to take some questions. So I think we've got some people in green shirts in the room with a roving mic, and please, if you're online, do send through your questions that way as well. But I just want to kick off by, I guess, relating what you've said to us to this concept of housing first, which is, it's great having a thing that we can name and have a label for something and talk about that. But I mean, really, what you've been talking about is quite a concerted effort, particularly to address the needs of the rough sleeping component of the homeless population, which has been obviously one of the more difficult cohorts to both house because it's expensive and also, because of many of the traumas and other issues that people have to help people to sustain those sorts of tendencies. When I'm, talking to people in my extended family or, just general people who aren't in the housing or homelessness sector about housing first, they're often quite, surprised to hear that homelessness services don't actually provide houses. That's not normally what happens. You said 105,000 people had access to homeless service during the COVID period. That didn't mean they were provided with a house, obviously, and that I think is something that, from a common sense perspective in the general public seems a bit odd. So what you're doing really is, what does seem quite straightforward at one level, but of course from your, and we all know from our involvement in those sectors that's it's been quite a tricky thing. So I guess what I'd like to get some thoughts on initially is why has it taken so long to join up those dots, and what was the role of was the pandemic that a necessary catalyst in a sense to get that happening, and what, I guess, do you see this as a permanent fixture now in the system? I might start with you, Sherri, if that's all right. Yeah.
So I started as a housing support worker in the early 90s, and back then I did a bit of a stint at in a city-based charity, homelessness charity, and I can remember if there was someone rough sleeping in Melbourne, our charity would get inundated by phone calls. I was just going to work and I saw this person, and you'd get half a dozen phone calls. People were outraged that they would see somebody rough sleeping and, get down there and sort that out. I don't know about you, but I'm staying over in South Bank here, and I opened the window and looked out on the beautiful Brisbane, and I reckon I counted 40 tents in the park across from me. So rough sleeping is now part of the homelessness service system experience that certainly in my experience, has significantly changed to being a very hidden, not that I'm saying rough sleeping didn't happen, but it was quite hidden to what you see now. I think part of the issue when we're talking about housing first is, in my mind, housing first seems to be, like I spend a lot of time with politicians in the local community, and I think housing first seems to be the answer to every question anyone's ever asked about housing and homelessness, right? But in my mind, housing first is a very particular product and investment for people experiencing rough sleeping. And when I think about a young person who's just come out of the family home, the last thing they want, and the last thing maybe not the last thing they want, but the last thing we should do is a housing first approach. For those young people, if it's safe, it should be a family first approach. It should be, getting those young people to a family response that is safe and effective for them. Or for people that are coming in that are falling behind in their rent, in the private rental market, but have got a history of being able to sustain that. The last thing you want to do is pull them out of that and put them into social housing. Like if they're working and they can sustain rent and just need an early intervention approach with some brokerage, then that's exactly what we should do. Housing first would be the last thing you'd want to do. So when we look at the 105,000 people coming into Victorian homelessness services, we've got to be really targeted at what's the problem that we're trying to address with housing first, and it's not everything to everybody, and we need to be really careful about that.
Humair, do you have any?
Yeah, I think the genesis of how, I think with the rough sleeping cohort, or generally with a lot of people in crisis, the notion was that they're probably not ready for long-term housing, right? So there had to be some kind of transitional pathway for them to enter into long-term housing. And I think Housing First has turned that over its head. It's just that, okay, house them first, provide the support, and that's a better way of then putting them into a refuge or transitional housing and preparing them for long-term housing. So I think that is the shift fundamentally, I think. But I think we've been, in various guises, we've been doing Housing First for a very long time, and I think Housing First principles of service delivery have to be embedded into our normal day-to-day business, because I think that's what, people just need a house generally, and all the other things follow, and you can resolve a lot of the issues if they are stabilized in some way. But a lot of people who are cultured into the street sleeping lifestyle, it is a big change. I think we saw in your case study as well that, the change from living in a confined space or out in the open into a house, there's a big, and that's why support is important. So I think for me, I think it's just a part of a continuum of services that we provided. We call it a very distinct product, but essentially it's just giving somebody a house, up front.
It's an interesting one. If you look at the European models, Housing First has been a very successful approach to addressing homelessness. However, in Europe, the government owns a much larger proportion of housing than the Australian housing model does. In Australia, we rely a lot more on private property ownership and investment. I suppose, to be controversial, Julie Collins, love her. Anthony Albanese, thank goodness he's in. The $10 billion is fantastic. We as a sector are falling over ourselves. Oh, we're so excited, we can't believe it. And then the next month we spent $368 billion on submarines. So for us as a sector, we're falling over ourselves for 10 billion, and that we're investing more money in other things, where I think housing your people is the most important thing that a country should do. So with that in mind, I think, you know, housing first, very successful approach, but we're in the situation we're in because of decades of underinvestment by a Commonwealth government, both Liberal and Labor, state and territory governments, and it's going to take a long time to dig ourselves out of the situation we're in, and we've heard today about all the innovative models. Housing first is absolutely one strategy. Rapid rehousing would remove a lot of people from the homeless sector that don't need to be there. Particular responses to domestic family violence, rapid rehousing would work very well. But then there's also the long-term response to deinstitutionalisation and people with complex needs, and that there does need to be some form of supported housing model for people with complex needs where housing first does not work as well. So what we need as a sector is a range of options for people. Thank you. And I agree with someone who mentioned earlier that 10,000 homes a year, every year, for the next 20 years would be a great outcome for our country.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the floor. I can't see very well beyond the line. Oh, okay, that's better. Are there any hands up on the floor?
There's one there.
There's some up there.
Ah, over there. Yeah, there's one over there, and I think there was one over here too. Thank you.
Over here, yeah. Hi, I'm Simone Parsons, Women's Community Shelters. I'm just interested in the gender experience of the Housing First programs, and across the panellists, whether there was some similarities and what you might attribute that to.
You want to go?
So in Victoria, we see a real gendered approach to homelessness. Our homelessness figures of throughout, you know, across the continuum of experiencing homelessness is about 50-50, a little bit different, but about 50-50. But we see rough sleeping much more prevalent in men, and in women we see couch surfing and insecure housing. So when we're looking at those sort of housing first approaches and the investment from the Victorian government about looking at who's actually in those hotels at the time of the end of the lockdown, there were more men than women, which is why we then sort of went back with a further investment to look at the Homes for Families program, to be very targeted to, which are predominantly women-headed families going into the Housing First program.
Yeah, we had a similar experience. So this was a criticism labelled at the Together Home program initially as well, that it is supporting mainly men because the rough sleeping cohort is mainly men, over other client groups that also need support. But I think what we did was that initially the first tranche was focused on rough sleepers. Then we expanded the guidelines for subsequent tranches to include other people as well. But I think even in the rough sleeping cohort, we had more than 30% women in that cohort, and of course the program supported them as well. But since then we have expanded the requirements to include people who have a previous history of homelessness, and that makes it more inclusive and brings more women and families into the fold. Yeah.
We had a question up here, I think. Is that right? No? Ah, there is one here.
I think there was one up there. I can see the hand, gentleman
Yeah.
up there.
If someone can bring a microphone up there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ben Smith from the Mornington Community Support Centre in Victoria. A question, I guess, for the departments, where there's perhaps a lack of service providers in an area, whether it be peri-regional or regional in particular, there might be a lack of service providers or funding for those operators. In a model similar to what we've seen in the ACT, where do you think the leadership sits when it comes to new initiatives that aren't able to be, initiated by smaller providers with lack of funding or capacity? Do you think that sits with the department or perhaps other leaders in the community? Just your comment on that.
Be good to hear from
New South Wales and Victoria, particularly there where you know, how you reached into the regions and if you noticed any differences.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, I'll go first. I think that's a really good question. And yes, there is disparities, and the support system is not uniform, and I think that came out in the evaluation as well, Tom, that there are regional differences. I think Housing First programs will be reliant on the broader support system anyway. I think even as clients exit the fairly high intensive support being provided to them under the program, they will fall back onto the existing system. And if the existing support service system is not there in regional areas, yeah, I think that's an issue for governments to think about, and how we, not individual departments, but as a government, maintain a service system that responds to the needs in the community. I think usually a lot of population-based funding allocations happen, and if it is a smaller area with less population, I think, you know, the support system probably is not there. And I think that, I'm sure a lot of practitioners in the room face that issue, where I think even housing practitioners, when they have a client in a house that has that desperate need and their tenancy is at risk, but there is no support service. Like, I know that I've heard stories about mental health support and other supports not being available for a lot of those clients. So I don't know, I think I have an answer for that. I think it's for governments to really consider and look at the broader system. But from a Housing First point of view, yes, that is critical. Otherwise, the program won't be successful.
So we've had a couple of different experiences from smaller providers who have been involved in the Housing First programs. And I think I'd start by saying that, you know, I think I speak on behalf of Homes Victoria, and we really value the local knowledge and the local connections that small agencies bring. I know that there've been, you know, some thinking, this sort of economic rationalist thinking that bigger is better for a really long time. But I think we should really buck that system, that way of thinking, because often small agencies are so intricately connected to their local community and have those really enduring networks and supports in the local community that that are just so difficult to get any other way. There's been two different experiences, I would say, in our Housing First programs. We run on consortias, and a number of those consortias have quite small organisations as part of their partnership. Some agencies have really thrived in that because they've been part of a larger consortia, they've been able to leverage those multidisciplinary teams across their consortias and bring in that value add, and their connection to local community has just really added to that consortia. Other smaller providers have actually found it quite difficult because of some of the issues that Anne was talking about. You know, it's hard work, it takes its toll on workers, it takes its toll on boards, it takes its toll on, you think you really want to get into this high risk work, and then all of a sudden the board starts getting a bit tetchy about it. So that can be hard for smaller organisations who perhaps don't have those sort of balance sheets or back of house corporate services to help them weather some of the challenges that can come up by, you know, pretty challenging behaviours that come out of or pretty challenging issues that you'd expect to see in a Housing First program. So I think we've seen a variety of ways that these kind of programs are having an impact on small providers.
My comments on that would be in terms of leadership. There's two aspects to it. First of all, in terms of government partnerships, local government is much easier to deal with than Commonwealth government because it's more personable in terms of building relationships. I mean, you talk to government and they talk about trusted partnerships. What's actually really a trusted partnership is an authentic two-way relationship where you can talk to government and they can honestly talk to you and you can sort things out. The other component that is really needed in those is leadership within your board. And you need to have a board of risk takers. You know, often boards step away from risk, but actually I often say if you're making money out of homelessness, you're doing it wrong, right? You're out there reaching to the most complex, the most disadvantaged people. So you need to make sure that supporting you in service delivery is a board who are prepared to take risks and put money where their mouth is. You create your networks of supports, and if you're in an area where you don't have much expertise, reach out to providers interstate who can support you through systems and policies and everything. I mean, I'm looking here in the ACT, I've got some of my partners here that we work very closely with. You compete with each other, but you support each other too because you're working with the same clients. So build those relationships, borrow their intellectual property and use it.
Thank you. Was there another burning question anywhere in the room? Yes, up there. Okay, I thought there was. Okay, thanks. To your right. To your right.
Hi, my name's Kevin Kingsby. I work for Mission Australia in Sydney. So firstly, I'd like to thank you guys from the ACT sharing those amazing programs. I've been doing this now for quite a long time, probably the best part of 20 years. And in that time, I've found it difficult to find people that agree with my perspective on dealing with homelessness, the housing first model. Anyway, don't get me started on that. So my question is for our New South Wales DCJ representation there. So given the outcomes of those programs in the ACT, will we be seeing more funding put towards more rounds of Together Home in New South Wales? And I ask that because I'm a manager of one of the support agencies in the North Sydney. And I heard Sue mention that retaining quality staff can be difficult. And what we've found, this isn't a criticism of Together Home, it's an amazing program. We've seen some amazing outcomes in northern Sydney. However, the problem has been in retaining those staff is that the rollouts of Tranche 1, 2 and 3, there's been no commitment after the first one. So we lose those quality staff that Sue mentioned that you really need on the front line dealing with complex clients. So in summary, my question is, do you think there will be more funding rolled out for Together Home, maybe even Tranche 4 in New South Wales?
No, that's a really good question. And I think it's a question on the minds of a lot of our partners in New South Wales, because you're right. I mean, retaining good staff and not having that certainty to actually then retain staff is a big issue, and is an issue that we are sort of grappling with at the moment. We are in the process of developing a housing and homelessness strategy in New South Wales. We are also waiting on the final results of the evaluation. To sort of commit to a longer-term housing first program, I think we want those things to come together. This housing strategy would definitely have something on that, but we are in the process of developing it. Now, in terms of the program, because of the subsequent tranches, we believe, and with the extension funding that was announced in this year's budget, we believe there's enough funding in the system to keep some of that going, especially for Tranche 3 clients, because we've got extension funding. And that will probably take us through to the time when the strategy is released and a new program, whatever shape it takes, is released. But at this stage, we don't have any confirmation of Together Home as a program focused on rough sleepers continuing as is, because like if we're looking at a broader housing first program, then it's more inclusive of other client groups. I think that's where we have to wait for the housing strategy and the homelessness strategy to come out.
Great, thank you all. Thank you all here on the panel as well. We've come to the end of our time and we're about to break for afternoon tea in the exhibition hall again, but please do join with me in thanking our panellists for their contribution.